In 1992, Honda's motorsport engineers were handed a car that was already perfect. They decided perfect wasn't good enough. What they built next became a legend, and it started with stripping out the air conditioning. Here's something they don't teach you in business school. Some of the most important cars ever made were built by people who were, technically, insubordinate. Not reckless, not stupid, just engineers who looked at a budget meeting, looked at a risk assessment, looked at a room full of executives saying, "That's not what we do here," and then went back to their desks and kept working. This is not a list of rebels for the sake of rebellion. Every car on this list exists because someone made a decision that was professionally dangerous, sometimes career-ending, and in every single case, correct. What follows is the story of 8 cars that should not exist, and why the world is better than they do. Number 8. Acura NSXR. The original NSX was already against the rules. The NSXR was against the rules of the car that was already against the rules. Honda's motorsport division, a group of engineers who by institutional culture were given somewhat more latitude than the road car teams, decided that the NSX they'd been handed was good, but not finished. They stripped air conditioning, they stripped the spare tire, they replaced the sound deadening with nothing. They fitted a limited slip differential that Honda's road car division had decided was unnecessary. Then they rebuilt the engine by hand. Every engine in every NSXR was assembled by a single technician, start to finish. That technician's name on a plate on the block. The result was a car 120 kilograms lighter than the car it was based on, with handling precision that contemporary testing put in direct competition with Ferrari and Porsche vehicles costing significantly more, from a Honda, assembled by engineers who had been told the existing car was sufficient. The NSXR is what happens when you give engineers a car that's already correct, and they decide correct isn't enough. Number 7. Ford GT. The Ford GT is the car that should have died in a PowerPoint presentation. When a small team at Ford began pushing the idea of reviving the GT40 nameplate for Ford's centennial in 2003, the project faced every institutional obstacle a legacy automaker can generate. It wasn't in the product plan. There was no business case. The development timeline, essentially 2 years from concept to production, was considered by Ford's own engineers to be somewhere between ambitious and delusional. The team around Chief Engineer Camilo Pardo did something unusual for a corporate environment. They showed up to every meeting with a car that looked better than the last time anyone had seen it, and they let the car do most of the arguing. By the time executives were being photographed next to the concept at auto shows, and the public response had made clear that Ford had accidentally promised America something extraordinary, canceling it had become politically impossible. 600 horsepower, 205 miles per hour, 0 to 60 in 3.3 seconds. The Ford GT arrived 2 years after the first sketch because a team of engineers understood that in a large organization, moving fast and showing results is a more effective argument than any memo ever written. Number 6. Dodge Challenger TA. Sometimes the story isn't about one engineer with a vision. Sometimes it's about a group of engineers finding a loophole big enough to drive a 340 cubic inch V8 through. In 1970, Chrysler's insurance-conscious management was actively trying to cool down the muscle car wars. Liability concerns, skyrocketing premiums for young buyers, the optics of selling teenagers cars with 400-plus horsepower. The solution, from the top, was to begin quietly limiting performance options. The solution from the engineers at Dodge was homologation. To race the new Challenger in SCCA's Trans Am series, they needed to produce a street-legal version. The rules required a minimum production run. The engineers packaged the racing-derived 346-pack engine, 3 two-barrel carburetors, revised heads, an attitude problem, into a street car that technically satisfied management's request to not build anything too extreme, because it was, technically, a racing homologation vehicle. The T/A produced 290 horsepower on paper. In practice, significantly more. It was sold with side exit exhausts and a fiberglass hood scoop. It is not subtle. Management got their compliance vehicle. Buyers got one of the most iconic muscle cars ever produced. The engineers got to keep their jobs. Number 5. Mazda RX-7 FD. By 1991, Mazda's management had serious questions about whether the rotary engine had a future. Fuel economy regulations were tightening, the rotary's thirst was a known liability. Multiple internal reviews had raised the question of whether the resources being allocated to rotary development should be redirected toward conventional engines that would be easier to certify and cheaper to operate in the real world. The engineers who had spent careers on the rotary, some of them had been there since Mazda licensed the technology in the 1960s, disagreed. Not quietly either. The argument they made was not sentimental, it was engineering-based. Sequential twin turbocharging could address the power density problem. 255 horsepower from 1.3 liters was a number that no piston engine was producing in a road car. The rotary's inherent smoothness, no reciprocating mass, no valve train, continuous power delivery, gave a driving character that no conventional engine could replicate. Management approved a final, full development cycle. The FD was the result. 50-50 weight distribution, 1,260 kilograms, a body that remains 30 years later one of the most cohesive sports car designs of the 20th century. It was the rotary's last stand, built by engineers who refused to let it go quietly, and who were right that it deserved better than a quiet end. Number 4. Ford Taurus SHO. The SHO, super high output, exists because of a phone call that Ford's management didn't know was happening. In the mid-1980s, Ford engineer Michael Cranafus wanted a performance version of the Taurus. Management was not interested. The Taurus was a family car. Family cars don't need 220 horsepower. This conversation ended with a no. Cranafus called Yamaha. Yamaha at the time was looking to expand its automotive engine business. The two parties developed, largely outside Ford's official product planning process, a 3.0-liter V6 engine that produced 220 horsepower. In 1989, from a naturally aspirated engine in a front-wheel drive family sedan, that number was genuinely startling. When the engine existed as a physical object and the performance data was in front of them, Ford's position on a performance Taurus changed. The SHO became one of the most celebrated performance sedans of its era. Car and Driver put it on their 10 best list 5 times. It developed a following that persists today, decades after production ended. It was built because an engineer decided that no from his management was the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of one, and then went and built the thing the negotiation was about before the negotiation resumed. Number 3. Toyota Prius. The Prius story is usually told as a triumph of corporate vision. Toyota saw the future, committed to it, delivered it. The version that's slightly more accurate is messier and considerably more interesting. The G21 project, Toyota's internal hybrid development program, was given a timeline that most engineers on the team privately considered impossible. The directive from management was to have a production-ready hybrid vehicle for the 1997 Tokyo Motor Show. The engineering team's assessment was that they needed at least another 2 years. Management's response, in the precise and bureaucratically Japanese phrasing of the era, was essentially, figure it out. What followed was 2 years of engineers working schedules that would be illegal in most countries today, solving problems that had no existing solutions because nobody had built this before, and in several documented cases making component decisions that deviated from what the official specifications required because the official specifications, under the timeline they'd been given, were physically unachievable. The Prius launched on schedule. It worked. Several of the unauthorized engineering decisions made under deadline pressure turned out to be correct long-term choices that remained in production Prius vehicles for a decade. The hybrid system that every major automaker subsequently spent billions replicating was built, in part, by engineers improvising against orders they couldn't fully comply with. Number 2. Pontiac Fiero. Here's a fun game. Name a mid-engine American sports car from the 1980s. Yeah, there's basically one answer. The Fiero was supposed to be a fuel-efficient commuter car. That was the whole pitch to GM's executives. Not a sports car, not a performance vehicle, a practical two-seater that happened to look good. The performance mandate was so explicitly off the table that the original engine was a 92 horsepower four-cylinder borrowed from the Chevette. The Chevette. But the engineers at Pontiac, specifically the team around Hulky Aldecacti, had built a mid-engine layout, rear-wheel drive platform, and a plastic body panel system that was genuinely innovative, and they knew what they had. So they did what engineers do. They filed the serial numbers off the Dream and shipped it inside a compliance vehicle. The Fiero sold over 370,000 units in its first 2 years. Buyers immediately understood what GM's executives had not, that this was a sports car, and they wanted a sports car. GM then did something extraordinary. They canceled the improved version, the 1988 redesign with a proper performance engine, revised suspension, and corrected weight distribution, the week before it was due to be greenlit for production. The car that would have fixed everything the critics complained about never arrived. The Fiero's engineers had built something real. The people above them decided, twice, that real wasn't what they were after. Number 1. Honda NSX. We saved this one for last, because this isn't just a story about one car. It's the story that started everything on this list. The NSX is famous for being a supercar that worked every day, a car Ayrton Senna helped develop, a car that embarrassed Ferrari into improving themselves. All of that is true. What's less known is that Honda's management, at multiple points in the car's 6-year development, tried to kill it. The original brief called for a smaller, cheaper sports car, something closer to a refined S2000. The engineering team, led by Shigeru Uehara, kept expanding the vision. All-aluminum monocoque, VTEC engine, suspension developed on track with one of the greatest racing drivers alive. The costs kept climbing, the timeline kept slipping. At one point, the project was formally reviewed for cancellation. Uehara's team responded by doing what engineers do when they believe in something. They worked harder and argued better. They demonstrated with data that what they were building could not be done cheaply, and that doing it cheaply would make it not worth doing at all. Management eventually agreed. The car that came out the other side won every comparison test it entered, stayed in production for 15 years without a fundamental redesign, and directly inspired Gordon Murray when he sat down to design the McLaren F1, widely considered the greatest road car ever built. You don't get that car by following the original brief. And the NSX-R, the car we started with, only existed because the NSX did. One act of insubordination made the next one possible. Every car on this list exists in spite of someone's spreadsheet. The engineers who built them weren't reckless, they weren't naive, they understood exactly what they were risking, budgets, timelines, in some cases their positions, and made a calculated decision that what they could build mattered more than the comfort of building only what they were asked for. Most of them were right. Not all of them were rewarded. The Fiero engineers watched their best work get canceled. The RX-7's engineers saw their engine discontinued. Plenty of the people in these stories retired, without anyone outside the industry knowing their names. But the cars exist. The technology spread. The McLaren F1 has an aluminum chassis because Honda proved one was possible. Every hybrid on the road today is downstream of engineers who worked impossible hours to hit a deadline that management probably shouldn't have set. The cars that move the industry forward are almost never the ones that came from a clean brief, an approved budget, and a timeline everyone agreed was realistic. They come from the people who heard no and decided the question wasn't finished yet.